Welcome along, everybody. Due to the what I can only describe as the roaring success of this program, a program which is now, I am told by very well-placed sources, more listened to, more viewed, and more appreciated than the entire output of the BBC Current Affairs unit. Though apparently that's a pretty low bar to get under. Now we have had this, a very good response from you, dear listeners and viewers. We've decided to expand operations a little bit into doing like various different special programs throughout each week. So you can expect to see more of this kind of content, which is focused on one subject. The subject in question today being, of course, the Trump tariff. So what do you get when you get a president born in 1946 with an obsession with 1886 trying to implement these policies in 2025? The answer is you get a mess. And now we go over live to a man who's been preparing for doomsday in his Hojarite bunker from an undisclosed location in the Balkans, Kit Clownberg. Hello to you, sir.
Hello, I have my AK-47 and my tin food ready.
Yes.
This is I mean, it's a Chinese curse. May you live in interesting times, and times just keep getting more interesting. But lucky for our listeners, we are on hand to help try and guide you and try and make sense of the insanity of now. I think
Yes.
that this is, I have seen a large, I mean, on top of some fantastic memes,
Mm.
referencing how tariffs have been levied on some Australian islands that have a penguin population,
Mm.
and are uninhabited by humans. I have seen a lot of confusion and conflicting takes on what these tariffs mean. I don't think that reflects poorly on the people themselves who are kind of befuddled by this. I think it actually is a kind of like manifestation of the fact that the people imposing them don't know what they're doing either. Like it's really
Yeah.
like they may have some objectives in mind, but actually, in terms of having any concrete idea of how to achieve them and whether these measures will actually do that, they're lost at sea.
Yeah.
Let's dig in, shall we?
Well, first thing, I'm going to show this briefly just to give an indication as to the scale here. The
Mm.
illegally occupied Malvinas Islands, which of course there was a war about in 1982, now have a tariff put on their goods of 41%. Now, I don't know what the fuck the VAT that the occupied Malvinas Islands are exporting to the United States, but I don't think Donald Trump and the people who put this on do either. You've got Lesotho being hit with 50%, Bosnia with 35%, scroll down, Serbia 37%, Sri Lanka 44%, Zimbabwe 18%. So like a lot of this is just completely arbitrary, and like Kit says, you can't blame anybody for losing track of it. But I think what we should do is to go along with what you've just been talking about, which is the sheer cluelessness of those who are actually trying to implement this policy and their massive overestimation of what the real story is here. Let's hear from a big wig in the Trump cabinet, which is of course Scott Bezant, the Treasury Secretary, who attempted recently on the Tucker Carlson show to explain the meaning of these tariffs. So let's just bring this video in, and then we can react to it. So I'm just going to share this screen here, and we can then hear from Bezant as to what he thinks he's doing.
No sound. No sound, Alex.
Oh, hang on. Do we have an issue with the sound?
Yeah. I can't hear anything.
Oh, right. Okay. Right. I'm going to pause for a second. Right. So let's share the wisdom of Mr. Bezant then.
You want to sell to Americans, you got to make it in America.
Sure. Or pay the tariff.
So how is China as a nation going to, I mean, this is such a big challenge. It's directly in their face. It's about every country on the globe, but it's really more than any other country about China. I think it's fair to say. How are they going to respond? What's their retaliation look like?
Well, I don't know if they can retaliate for a couple of reasons. If you look at the history, and I used to teach economic history, and when you look at the history, we are the debtor nation.
Yes.
We have the trade deficits. The surplus nation is in the weaker position because the Chinese business model, and Tucker, by the way, the Chinese business model and the economy are the most unbalanced, imbalanced in the history of the modern world. We've never seen anything like this in terms of their export level relative to their GDP, relative to their population. So I think it is going to be very difficult for them to try to change the model. They're in a deflationary recession / depression right now. They're trying to export their way out of it, and we can't let them do that. But I think that, when you think the Chinese manufacturing system is like that old Disney movie with the brooms carrying the buckets.
Yeah.
There's nothing you can do. Like, that's their business model. It's not going to stop. Now, what could happen if you were to say, Scott, look, what's the dream scenario? That somehow there could be a deal where the U.S. and China, we want more manufacturing, which would mean a smaller part of the economy's consumption. The Chinese have this imbalanced economy with too much manufacturing, and actually the Chinese consumers really get the short end of the stick. So Chinese households, they're called in what's called the middle income trap. That could we do something together to say, okay, you rebalance, you consume more, manufacture less. We are going to consume less and manufacture more, and we'll be military rivals. There'll still be an economic rivalry, but we're going to level the playing field by a lot. Now, that's not going to happen tomorrow. That's not going to happen in a month. But over the next few years, they may have to come around because I think their business model is broken. I think President Trump's broken their business model with these tariffs.
So you're describing, the famous scenario where if you take a bank loan, the bank is in charge. They can repossess whatever you borrowed against. But if you take a big enough loan, you're kind of in charge of the bank.
Exactly. And they've just got such a big deficit with us that
they need our markets.
They can't survive with that.
Are you confident that there's like a clear enough channel of communication between the two governments that the details can be worked out and that nothing will go crazy in the meantime?
Well, I think what gives me a lot of confidence is the relationship between President Trump and Chairman Xi.
Yes.
That when you have a direct line of communication at the very top, then I think it's very difficult for things to go haywire.
Well, that is an extremely, shall we say, interesting take on things. It's also wildly delusional and completely out of touch. Kit, do you want to start off by explaining just how wrong Bezant is in, shall we say, 200,000 words or less?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to know where to begin with this. I mean, this guy's like an economic historian, right? And he is now the US Treasury Secretary, which at least theoretically is a extremely influential, powerful position, who is now overseeing this policy of tariffs. And his understanding of the Chinese economy is about comparable to a Beatles understanding of nuclear fusion. I mean, it's difficult to come up with an analogy that underlines sufficiently how utterly delusional and wrong what he is saying is. So he talks about China's this ahistorical, unprecedented trade imbalance where China is completely dependent on exports to keep its lights on and to stave off depression. What's actually historic and unprecedented about China is that it does lead the world in exports, but in terms of exports as a proportion of its overall economy, it is tiny. It is about a fifth because they are focused on domestic growth. Now, to give you an example, the UK, which makes almost nothing, or at least nothing that anyone wants to buy apart from weapons, maybe. Their exports are 32% of their economy. Okay, so that is more than China's exports. They are more dependent on exports than China. The UK has also been tariffed, and we'll get into this later. South Korea, close to half their economy is exports. Germany, 40%. Okay, so it is just a complete, and these are very easily available figures on, using internet search engines, right? So it is a complete fiction and lie. It's not even wrong to suggest that China is overly exclusively and dangerously dependent on exports and needs the US more than vice versa. An enormous amount of American quote unquote goods, which is to say American branded goods, which are not American goods at all because they're not actually made in America, they're made elsewhere and they just get badged with American labels, iPhones being a very obvious example. That is a demonstration of how much the US needs China more than vice versa. And I see that the price of a variety of supposedly US, like branded products for consumers have rocketed in price since these tariffs were announced. And this is not, again, we will get into this in more detail. This is not a short-term thing, like at all, because the Trump administration has written very clearly on the wall that we are moving towards kind of an autarkic global economic model. Right. So where countries are going to be forced to rely on domestic consumption. And actually, number one, this is going to hurt the US quite considerably. But B, it could potentially, and this is only potentially, have enormously positive benefits to the US's neocolonial holdings across particularly across the global south, but also closer to the imperial core within Europe itself.
Well, it also shows that like the research done by like the Trump administration and its officials into the Chinese economy is appallingly out of date. Because like if Bezant was making this case in 2004 or even in 2010, then he might have had a little bit more validity to what he's saying about China being massively exposed to tariffs because they're so dependent upon exports into the US and other imperial core nations. The Chinese realized that they were overly exposed that way around about 2008, where they had to, lest we forget, bail out the US by buying gigantic amounts of US dollar bonds to make sure that the US export market remained active. After that, they started rebalancing their economy towards domestic consumption and towards a new model that would be in line with the Communist Party of China's stated aim of a moderately prosperous socialist economy by 2050. So they knew what the risks were, and they knew that the US would make such moves as have been made over the last decade or so to try and whack the Chinese. There is this delusional belief expressed by Bezant and others that they can somehow derail Chinese growth or China's already a recession. China's growth rate hovers between 4.5% and 5%. Yeah. US growth rate, like what? At most 2% over the last decade.
And that's in financial services. And it's also in the growth of, I saw some fantastic research recently that like an enormous amount of US growth is driven by the cost of their healthcare sector.
Yeah.
Like that's
so
really
literal
interesting.
Parasitism of the worst kind. So who's actually in the recession? Because the truth is that although China might have topped out around about, in terms of its 10% growth rates in the 2000s, where it was growing at an astonishing rate of knots, like they've rebalanced things to around about a 4.5% to 5% growth rate over the last decade or so. It's come down to that. And they're still sustaining a far higher rate of growth than any of the imperial core nations and have rebalanced their trade patterns away from being overly exposed to markets in the US or the EU or G7 nations. So Bezant's just plain wrong. Like they have no leverage on the Chinese anymore. It's gone. And the Chinese are more than that, are pursuing a line of development which is, or seems to be at this stage, genuinely different in that they are offering various things such as very low to zero tariff economic relationships with individual countries. And you can speak a little bit about this with regard to Serbia, that is infinitely more advantageous to the development of a domestic economy than anything the US or the G7 nations are going to offer anybody. So the only way that protectionism actually works, and I'll just finish on this point for now, is
Sure.
if you have something to protect. What is the US actually protecting? Is the question. What their amazing healthcare sector, the insurance sector, the bullshit economy, the moving around of money. Like this would only work if you had a developing domestic manufacturing sector. The US doesn't. They have a manufacturing sector which is withering away because, relatively speaking, the high cost of US labor versus labor elsewhere. That's the fundamental problem that's at the heart of it. These people don't understand the system they're even running, but they are convinced that they can just do this and somehow things will just snap back into place. It's insane. But I'll throw to you for more about the Chinese model and associated effects.
Well, I mean, number one, I mean, I might add that, like, I mean, you mentioned that Trump is a president stuck in 1864. I mean, I genuinely, whether they would articulate it as such or not, I genuinely think that when America firsters talk about, like, restoring jobs for Americans, like, are we talking about bringing back sweatshops?
Yes.
Like, to the US, like, I mean, is that what they want back? I mean, quite possibly, and I think that's, again, a potential upshot of this. Now, I might add that, yeah, I mean, as just based on my kind of like local experience, the and knowledge, right? So, Serbia, as you mentioned in the introduction, it has been hit with the highest tariffs in Europe, which is 38%. Neighboring Bosnia and Herzegovina, I believe it's 35 or 36. They are very high for no apparent reason. There is some speculation locally. It's because of Serbia's economic relations with Russia and China. Now, if so, that's heavily ironic because what's going to happen is that what is actually in many ways, a kind of low level economic relationship with China, which is based on a free trade, tariff free relationship, which would be larger were it not for the EU placing restrictions as part of Serbia's membership application, which, bearing in mind that something like 80% of the population, if not more, don't even want to join the EU anyway. There are if you go to any Serbian city or town of any size, you will find a Chinese run mega market where you can buy pretty much anything you could possibly ever want. Every single conceivable consumer good or household necessity can be found in these stores. They are extremely high quality. They are extremely low cost. And it's also created significant job opportunities locally, in a region that suffers from a chronic shortage of job opportunities and low wages. They have been a real economic and financial shot in the arm to previously depressed and depopulating areas of Serbia. Now, a very obvious upshot of the US trying to tariff everyone, every country in the world into submission, is that a large number of countries will be looking to deepen their economic ties with China. And I would imagine that countries like Serbia, which have benefited significantly already from from those bonds, will already be in talks to do so. I mean, throughout the wider Balkan region, there is a need for massive upgrades in infrastructure, wider investment in all sorts of fields, which is not forthcoming from the EU and the US. Like Albania had to shut down its train system in 2021, I believe. I mean, it was already, about the worst in Europe and about as slow as walking. And they were blocked from the Chinese put in a bid to buy and regenerate Albania's rail network, and they were blocked by the US. Macedonia has just shut down its local bus networks because they can't afford to run them. Again, this is an area where the Chinese could, have a revolutionary impact locally. And I think that what's probably going to happen, I mean, and when I say probably, I mean almost inevitably, just due to sheer geopolitical gravity and a lack of options created by these US tariffs, is that a large number of countries are going to be looking to China for assistance, and they, knowing that they've already been, effectively penalized by the US just by token of existing, they're not going to be particularly concerned about the consequences of how the US might respond to this. Now, I mean, again, this is something that we might get into in more detail later, but just showing like the lack of understanding in the mainstream of the tariffs. I have seen a large number of pundits and Western news outlets, including the BBC, make much of the fact that Russia hasn't been subject to tariffs, as if this is somehow deeply mysterious and suspicious. It's already the most sanctioned country in the world. So which is not trading with the US at all, except through third parties, by and large. What tariffs can you impose on them?
Absolutely nothing, as it turns out.
Yeah. And it's like, so I think that bearing in mind that, yes, as I say, that these countries have already been penalized by the US by the US economically to a significant degree, they're probably going to think, well, fuck it. And any reservations on the part of their ruling elites to seeking economic partnerships and deepening ties with alternative local and international powers and players are going to just be nullified, because it's like, well, I mean, what other options do you have?
Well, none. I mean, the truth is that the way to development, actual development, does not lie through an alliance with the US. I mean,
No.
people, and it never has, or Britain. People give the example of like Taiwan, South Korea, and post-war Japan. Now, all of those were industrialized in the way that they were because it suited the interests of the imperialists to do so at a specific point in time. Japan was basically reindustrialized on the back of the need for an armaments drive to run the Korean War from, basically. That's where it began. South Korea was turned into like a manufacturing center in order to compete with the actually more developed North in the 60s and the 70s. And that's why the US was forced to back its industrialization. Same with Taiwan with regard to China. And so, like, other than that, the path for those who have been aligned with the US over the last 30 years at least has been one of asset stripping and impoverishment. In terms of those who are aligned with the US, those who are aligned with the EU and Britain. And in using the example of like Albania, which you've just given with regard to the railway system, Albania basically post socialism has been effectively returned to the relationship it had with the imperialist powers prior to 1945, which is it's an agricultural export economy with its biggest customer being the Italians. The old former colonial master. So this is what the post-socialism world delivered, but I won't get into that for now. The point is that the Chinese, regardless of whatever questions or criticisms one can have of their current model, do offer development and do offer the chance to actually partner with them to build infrastructure and develop commercial opportunities as well. The US just wants to keep nations poor, basically. and as do the British, as do everybody else. And so therefore it's going to be increasingly fatal, in to use the example of the region you're in, for a Balkan politician to be aligned with the EU and the US in the near future. In fact, it's already very unpopular, but it's going to be absolutely fatal when, again, you can have the route of development via partnership with the Chinese, or you can have the route of like being tariffed to death and forced into economic subjugation via the US and the EU. Because the EU is going to be slapping tariffs all over the place as well. There is already a big row about that, as we'll come to. So there's no positive side to having a relationship with the US. None. And they have nothing to offer. And this is only going to accelerate the move towards like a breakdown of the US-led global system. And the danger of it is that the people running this have no comprehension of the system that they're running. And I'm just going to give a quick example as to why. The basis of imperialism is the export of capital overseas, because doing the manufacturing domestically is too expensive. So you close down the industrial sectors at home. You set up a supply chain to import it all from, well, China or via Mexico or from Indonesia or Thailand or wherever. So you try and shut that down without having an alternative. All you're going to end up doing is like massively jacking up the prices of consumer goods for the American working class. Because at the moment, they have no alternative supply chain. None whatsoever. So they're going to put prices through the roof. And at the same time, you're going to essentially focus on wage restraint for the working class at home. So you said, do they want sweatshops? Well, the average MAGA voter, working class American who's voted for Trump, might not want that. But in actual fact, that's the only way it's going to come back. Steel mills only return to America is if steel mills can operate on the same basis as they do in places like India, which means like the Rust Belt worker doesn't get the post-World War II dream back. He gets like the pre-World War I scenario back. Dirty, dangerous, unregulated, no unions, low wages. That's the only way this happens. And in some ways, Trump is a godsend for the likes of us, because he's going to demonstrate the validity of the Marxist-Leninist analysis of imperialism by trying to do just that. And what he's going to find is he can't do it. Now, there is a question as to whether the US ruling class pulls the trigger on him, not literally, maybe, and disposes of him at some point. But we will see. Now, did you want to add anything on that, or should we jump to Perfidious Albion?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is actually quite a nice lead in to the UK. So I think that like one, I mean, we as we've discussed, like partnering with the US or being economically subjugated to the US is the road to ruin. And the fact of the matter is that there are numerous examples throughout history of the US allowing countries to become industrial competitors, and then effectively nuking them, right? And you could argue that Germany and its deindustrialization as a result of the US led sanctions against Russia is a modern example of this. A little considered example of this phenomenon is Japan. So following World War II, Japan, for a variety of reasons, including the fact that the US wanted to pacify the local population, particularly with regard to its heavy occupation by US forces, which was deeply unpopular. They allowed Japan to become a manufacturing superpower in many ways, but albeit not in the military sphere. And in the 1980s, it seemed that Japan was well en route to becoming a major economic power on a par with the US or indeed the entirety of Europe. However, and I might add as well that this is around the time that suddenly you get a flood of Hollywood movies in which the villains are Japanese, and you also there was the release of a book by some neocon idiot called George Friedman, who it was called the Coming War with Japan, and he predicted a shooting war between Tokyo and Washington within the next 2 decades because of Japan's rising economic power and the threat they pose to US interests across the globe. At the end of the 1980s, the US heavily encouraged Japan to reduce significantly its restrictions on its to deregulate its financial system. Okay, which led to effectively a miniature version of the 2008 financial crisis, where Japanese banks were lending enormous amounts of money and giving mortgages and loans to people who had no means of paying them back. And then you have in the early 90s the effective collapse of the Japanese economy, and they've been in free fall ever since. Every single decade, we hear about the latest lost decade that Japan has suffered. You know, this is like staged, managed, deliberate decline.
Yes, and the Plaza Accords were one such example of that, where they
Yes. Yeah.
the US, as you said, forced that agreement through. Like they made it clear that they will allow Japan to develop as long as it is in their interest to do so. The moment that it's not, they get scalped. Another
Yeah.
example would be even from a little bit earlier, where they stuck the West Germans with the bill for the US occupation of Germany in
Yes.
the early 1970s. And then so this is how imperialist blocs work, which is that they're never coherent. Like they will work together to take on a common enemy for a specific amount of time. So, like the post World War II Soviet Union, for instance, and they will work to take out certain countries in which they have a shared interest in destroying, for instance, Yugoslavia. But they were always and constantly trying to undermine and destroy each other at the same time. So, like the
Yes.
US is constantly trying to assail the positions of the British, of the French, of the Germans, of the Italians, of the Canadians, and at the same time screaming about universal values, rules-based order, etc. But this is just how imperialism works. It is chaotic in the way it approaches things, in that they can't stop competing with each other and trying to do each other over. And so the Americans end up weakening their position long term in Japan by destroying its economy. They also scalped the Japanese high-tech sector in the early 90s by triggering an economic collapse, then buying up a load of like high-tech Japanese companies and like rolling them into American companies. It's what they
Yeah.
wanted to do with the Chinese, with the whole Chips Act thing. They wanted
Mhm.
to basically destroy Chinese chip manufacturing, and all that it managed to do was that because the Chinese government was never compromised and compradored into control by the US. And they, of course, didn't allow the US to do a Plaza Accords on them. So you had the US whinging for ages about the Chinese being very unfair to them, which I always find like the whinging of the imperialists to be both pathetic and nauseous at the same time, nausea-inducing. But of course, the Chinese are run by this the government. The system is run by the CPC. The CPC under Xi defeated the comprador tendency comprehensively about a decade ago. See, those people did exist in the CPC. The sort of people who are very close to like Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin and others. They were in there, and they were like did have a certain influence. And you notice that they're the people who've been purged. Those are all the people who
Mm.
like ended up with long prison sentences or put to death, because the system got to a certain extent cleaned out of those people. So the US and the British influence within the CPC dropped to basically nothing, and then they rebalanced their economy as a result, meaning that the amount of influence the imperialists can wield inside the Chinese political system is practically zero or incredibly small. And this was compounded by the clumsy attempt at a color revolution in Hong Kong in 2019, where the US and British thought they had the CPC on the run, and it turned out that they didn't. All that ended up happening was that their own networks got exposed and a lot of people got arrested. So
Mm.
their ability to impact Chinese decision making is diminishing all the time. And yet you get this wild nonsense coming out of the US about how they can do this, that, or the other. It doesn't work anymore. The Chinese have studied the Plaza Accords in great detail and did so a long time back and drew all the appropriate lessons from it, which is don't expose yourself too much to the US market. don't allow the US to exercise control in your political system, and basically be prepared to tell the US to fuck off when they come whinging about the strength of the renminbi, you know? So this, I think, leads us to a very interesting pivot point where we consider the impact of the tariffs on a returning favorite, which is, of course, the land of where we both originate from, which is, of course, old perfidious Albion itself. And Keir Starmer, or Sir Keir, to give him his proper title, I mean, if a man covers up for pedo scandals for that long, he really does earn his knighthood. He's talking a very, very big game recently in the Daily Telegraph, where he's been written his traditional article, or so should we say, Paul Mason has probably ghost written it for him, where he's claiming that it's the end of globalization as we know it. Because he has shown such great leadership, the what will happen is that he's going to be able to lead the UK through this. Now, this is, of course, complete gibberish of the worst kind, and the fact that he cites in his example, like the fact that he's led the way on Ukraine, shows just how utterly insane the thinking of the UK political leadership actually is. But your response, Kit, to the line the British government is taking and the fit of delusions gripping the British commentariat.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you archive.is, I've managed to access the full piece, but I mean, the Telegraph article is worth reading because yes, whoever ghost wrote whichever likely paedophile ghost wrote this for Keir Starmer, it's like he ties this in with UK standing firm in its support for Ukraine. That is, and he states, we know this approach works. That is why on tariffs, the immediate priority is to keep calm and fight for the best deal. And I think in the manner of Ukraine, he is a one-legged man approaching an arse-kicking contest, really. I mean, as the tie-in with Japan is that, like, Britain's economy is heavily financialized, and that's not just in terms of the outsized role of the city and Britain's various kind of international spider's web of tax havens and money laundering centers. It's the fact that, like, so much of British business is dependent on loans from the financial sector to keep their lights on. Venture capital is behind, chains of pubs and, like, all sorts of things. These tariffs are going to be really bad for the UK. They're going to be really, really, really bad. And they are left standing there, having deregulated again with US encouragement massively. They're left standing with their dick in their hand. They have no response to this whatsoever at all. And however, as embarrassing and awful as Keir Starmer's latest effort to play Churchill and act tough comes across, he was somewhat adroit in acknowledging that the US tariffs are not just a short-term tactical exercise. Okay, so he actually has the nous, or again, the people around him, maybe the heads of MI6 and MI5, they understand that this is not going to be temporary, and actually that this is a major, major. I hate to use this marketing phrase, but a major paradigm shift, which or call it an epochal shift, which is going to endure for a very long time and have all sorts of implications globally. Some predictable, as we've discussed, some unpredictable. But I think that what's quite interesting is that the liberal commentariat has responded to the Trump tariffs in the opposite way, as they've responded to all manner of things with Trump, including the war in Ukraine. So Simon Jenkins, the one of the Guardian's worst columnists, and that's a very competitive category. He wrote on Friday last week, April 4th, which well, look, tariffs are bad, but don't forget, Trump will be gone in 4 years. Now, we hear this a lot. Yes, again, particularly with Ukraine. Don't worry, just keep hanging on. As long as you've got like some male population left, we can win it when Trump finally leaves. I mean, there are so many assumptions wrapped up in this, including the fact that, I mean, number one, the Democrats have any prospect whatsoever of regaining power in 2028, which, I mean, has anyone heard from them recently? Well,
Bernie
I mean,
Sanders is on tour. He's going to run at
oh
the age
yeah.
of 86.
Yeah, well, there's Bernie doing his kindly grandpa bit, which is not which is no longer believed by anyone with an IQ above double digits. But aside from that, like the Democrats are nowhere to be seen on any major issue. It assumes that the Republican Party isn't fully wedded to the quote unquote Trump doctrine, or indeed conversely, that Trump doesn't reflect Republican thinking more widely, but also, yeah, that it assumes that Trump is an aberration. No, I think that there is a wider sense within the imperial brain trust that, like, well, America is in decline, and one way that we're going to offset this decline and try and steer the try and steer things back in the direction of the new American century that the neoconservatives were boasting about at the end of the last millennium, and has failed spectacularly to arrive. I think that this, from the perspective of major US policy planners, who are not based in the White House, but within the halls of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission, of which Keir Starmer is a member, of course, is that, yeah, that I think that they view the tariffs as a form of self-imposed managed decline. It's like the US is retreating from the world, but on its own terms. So it's still a victory, even if we're on the run, right?
Yes.
But again, it is based on a fundamental delusion and a total lack of understanding about the global economy and also America's place within it.
Yes, and I think that leads us nicely to a sort of brief diversion, shall we say, into the
Yes.
nature of globalization, because like the nature of globalization is completely misunderstood, and I don't blame anybody for misunderstanding it, because the
Yes.
academic literature on it is bollocks from top to bottom. And I speak as somebody who was forced to read this garbage 20 years ago
Yes.
and probably haven't recovered from it. Now, the conventional narrative is that, the world is going to be one big global village with various different parts of the world dedicated to manufacturing certain things. And Britain, of course, will become the knowledge economy, that old chestnut, whereby we sell services and experiences to people, basically a nation of management consultants. And with the economy powered by financial services, minimal manufacturing, with most of that done overseas in hyper-exploitative, very profitable conditions, of course. Now, the problem with that narrative is, of course, it's written by liberals who ignore the central role of imperialism in all of this. The truth is that the collapse of the socialist bloc in the early 1990s, 1990 to 91, opened up a land of opportunity for the US and the Brits that would not have existed otherwise, and they were already in a deep crisis before that came along. This system ran out of juice. My argument, and the argument of others who sort of share my beliefs, is around about the 1960s, is when the US went over the hill as an industrial power. Since then, it's been a case of like demolishing the living standards of the domestic working class in the imperial core countries, and exporting manufacturing elsewhere via export of capital to try and rebalance things. So you create the consumer economies of the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s by having it all manufactured in China, Indonesia, Cambodia, other places like that. And you can only sustain that as long as you can sustain the relationship, as J.D. Vance actually argued himself, the US vice president, as long as you can sustain the subordination of those countries. And as long as that can be done, the US was prepared to accept that. As long as, if China had not developed in the way that it has in terms of its revolution in its own scientific and technological base, it just remained a place where you got low wage work done on manufacturing commodities purely for export to Western markets, then there would be no US-China problem. It would only be that the US was very happy with China, and if the CPC was run by compradors, they could turn up to Washington, get a pat on the head, and get told, "Well done, lads," more of the same. The problem for this model is it didn't actually address the issue of the long-term decline of the US and the British as an imperial power, which is that you can't run an economy on fumes, which is what's been going on. And you can't run an economy just on the moving around of capital. Fundamentally, something will snap in this, and something's been snapping, and the system's been coming to pieces for over 17 years now. And so Trump is a manifestation of this decline, meaning that a certain section of the US ruling class has decided that the situation is currently unsustainable, but they don't have a solution. The gap, the split is between those who think that they can sort of tariff their way back into success one way or the other, and those who think they should just sit there, continue moving money around, and just sit there and continue the system as it stands indefinitely, which is the Democratic Party's point of view. Interspersed, but also, it must be said, interspersed with random outbursts of like statist economic intervention, even from the Democrats. So the Democrats, of course, kept a number of Trump tariffs from his last presidency. So the tariffs would have come whether it was Trump or whether it was Harris, because it represents a fundamental problem for the US economy as a whole. But the only difference is that Trump's gone big and grandiose with it. The Democrats would have probably done the same thing, but maybe a little bit different. It represents a crisis in the system itself. And so Simon Jenkins and those who think, oh, it's all going to blow over, like that is sort of a classic piece of like British establishment complacency, which again, they're not unified on, because even they have worked out that this is a permanent move. They just don't know what to do about it. The only solution, and I will just finish on this point, for the British ruling class is roughly the same as the US ruling class, which is pushing the working class domestically into sweatshops. That's the way it's going to go. And that's the real danger of all this like militarism and police state shit they're doing. That's what it's fundamentally going to be about, which is they can't take on Russia. They've proved that. They can't take on China. They've proved that. They won't be able to take on Iran either, because the oil trade routes of the world will get blown up. So what's the solution? Your solution will be an internal class war. That's what will happen. And that's the only thing they're going to be capable of waging. So the sooner everybody wakes up to this reality that once they've run out of juice in terms of being imperial powers, the target is us. That's what the real target is going to end up being. But I'll throw back to you, Kit, for your thoughts.
Well, yeah, I mean, total agreement and very eloquently put, my friend. And I think that like that you mentioned Vance's comments, and I was actually going to cite them myself, because I thought that it was. I mean, this was in late February, I believe. I mean, or was it? Time flies so quickly now. It might have been late March. He made this astonishing admission where he stated that, well, the whole point of globalization was that rich countries would move further up the value chain while poor countries made the simpler things. And then he went on to lament that things didn't work out this way because it turns out that poor countries were not happy being subjugated and didn't want to just be sources of cheap labor and resources and markets for Western made goods, and started moving up the value chain themselves. And he states, well, globalization has been a failure. And it's like, yeah, this is the the myopia, but also just the delusion and quite frankly stupidity of like the British and American ruling elite mindset, which is okay. Well, globalization as we wanted it to work didn't, so we're just going to reverse it and everything's going to go back to normal. It's like, it's like we've opened this Pandora's box, and then we're just going to close it and everything. And the last 30 years of, I mean, you go, we could date it a lot back a lot further, but the last 30 years of stagnation, if not like just splintering and to the point of borderline collapse of Anglo-American global capitalism is just going to be undone by making it more expensive for Canada to buy American bourbon. I mean, it's like, that's the extent of their solution to this panoply of issues that their own actions have caused. And I do think that, yeah, that there is, we've discussed this on the show before, but like there is that there is that imperialist hubris, which is like is so hardwired into the brains of elites. And like, I mean, this is completely tangential, but I think we've discussed this on the show before, that one of the reasons that the right wing of the British ruling elite was so keen on entering the EU is it was assumed that Britain, what would become the dominant economic and political power within, well, what was then the European community, and then became the EU, just because. Well, we're the British, so well, yeah, we're just going to dominate. We're just going to dominate the and we're going to lead Europe. And I mean, there was the Sun, which was very pro, as was joining the EC, as was Thatcher. It ran a headline saying Britain has lost an empire but gained a continent. I mean, like, this is just this sense of like, well, we're number one, and that will endure forever. We will enjoy all of these benefits without any of the downsides because reasons. And like that, like it was very, 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 very clear that countries were not going to, without like massive repression, and all sorts of other mechanisms of deliberate blocking of development. Like, I mean, we've discussed we're going to one way or another rise. They were not going to accept being cheap, just cheap sweatshop labor forever. Just because the US and Britain wanted them to. And I mean, on the subject of Chinese models of capitalism, China is helping countries in the global south manufacture their own goods, which is a whole other form of threat to the Anglo-American global capitalist system, but it also is kind of going to neutralize the negative effects of tariffs, because countries will have not only the resources but also the technological ability to make their own things. Which is one of the key ways that the US and Europe deliberately keep countries underdeveloped, is by forcing the kind of neocolonial dependency on them, where they are effectively prohibited from doing anything economically apart from exporting their resources for pennies, and then using whatever profits they get from that to buy Western goods. The US has just electively made it more difficult and expensive for them to buy Western goods. Well done. I mean, it's quite remarkable.
Well, yes, and this is again, this points to a fundamental misunderstanding of the system that they sit at the middle of. Like, Vance appears to have some understanding of what the US intentions behind the globalization period were. He just has no understanding of what to do about it, because you can't do anything about it. And so if you're going to make what Western goods are exported more expensive to buy, then well, you've just handed China or India or Brazil more of a market. And also, this fundamentally is the relationship that the Chinese have with their various partners across the world. I mean, not to say that there aren't some issues that arise from this, but fundamentally, it's a non-imperialist relationship because the Chinese do encourage balanced development of an economy. It's one of the things that that their partnerships are valued for. Whereas what industrialization does take place when the US or the British or the French subjugate a country is all on unbalanced in one direction. So you might get, say, let's just use Mali for an example. The
Mm.
French dominated Mali in a neocolonial fashion for 60 plus years following direct occupation under colonialism. What was encouraged in terms of development? Only like uranium mining and gold mining. So like the rest of like the economy of Mali remained woefully underdeveloped. So you had like tiny islands of industrialization around sites of resource extraction. That's the imperialist model. You don't get the wider development that you need to actually modernize a country. Imperialists don't want that. They want resource extraction done as cheaply as possible. Whereas Chinese development comes with a whole load of other things, such as infrastructure, such as public sector development, that again, the US, the British, the Europeans just don't do. And so, again, like this points to the fact that like Trump's gang don't understand the system that they're running. People like Peter Navarro don't understand how US imperialism actually works because they don't understand the imperialist extraction mechanisms. So Trump says, like, oh, everybody's ripping us off. What's going on? It's like, no, that's as ridiculous as like somebody like Lord Salisbury in the 1890s in Britain proclaiming that the empire was too expensive because of the amount of
Mm.
money that got sent to India every year, never looking
Mm.
for a moment at the amount that got extracted from India over many, many decades. Whereas like Trump looks at like the trade imbalance and sees something which is harmful. Whereas like the US ruling class looks at the trade imbalance and sees that as something which is positive. And again, this is why you should read journals such as the Wall Street Journal, because they're actually quite honest when they said in a recent article in response to Trump's threats, as they were at the time, of tariffs,
Mm.
that Trump doesn't understand that essentially the US car industry is not a US car industry. It's a North
Mm.
American car industry, meaning you've got component parts, some brought in from China, it must be said, but assembled in Canada, Mexico, brought in to have the finishing touches put to them by car plants in the US so they can stick the US made in USA stamp on it. But it's not made in USA. It's made in all these different places. So if you tariff Canada and Mexico to death, you're basically all you're going to do is disrupt the business model for the US car industry with no plan in place as to how to develop an alternative production facility. These people are stuck in the grip of absolute magical thinking. And again, go
Mm.
back and watch our previous episodes of the show because you'll see it's consistent, dear viewers and listeners. You'll see every single thing, whether it's the British in particular, but the US as well, thinking that just by sheer amount of like capital moved around or numbers on a balance sheet or the sheer weight of the gigantic, power of Western civilization can somehow overcome these barbarians in Russia or overcome, the Oriental madmen in China or something like that. And what do
Mm.
you know? It doesn't work. Material reality catches up with the imperialists every single time, and they find, to their horror, that they were wrong. Their model was wrong. Every solution they pursued to the crisis that's afflicted imperialism since prior to World War One has only made the crisis worse. And this is, I don't want to say the end game, but I suspect it might be the end game because where is there to go now?
Indeed. I mean, you mentioned Lord Salisbury complaining. I think that didn't he use a phrase like the empire is an open wallet upon which the sun never sets, or something
Yes,
like
it was
that?
something
I
like
think, which is
that.
yeah, 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 yeah. Like it's quite remarkable, and I think that yeah, you mentioned the way that the financial media is responding to this. There have been some incredible headlines about how people in the city of London and other major financial centers are absolutely shitting themselves about this, which is always a great laugh. But I mean, the fact of the matter is, as well, is that the outlets like the Wall Street Journal are effectively as good as reflecting what not only what we're saying here, but are almost speaking in Marxist-Leninist terms about autarky and economic nationalism. Like they predict that as a pretty inevitable upshot of this, and talking about the potential benefits of it from the perspective of investors, like at least domestically. I mean, it's really quite remarkable. I mean, and I think this is this is mere days after the tariffs have been implemented. I think that we are going to see a lot. This is just the beginning. We're going to be seeing a lot of very rapid developments in in a lot of different areas. And it's going to be important to keep an eye on, because there is the prospect that having actually like electively not only tanked the US economy, but also thrown the international economy into disarray, that there is the prospect that, well, we could of elites thinking a good way of distracting people would be a major global conflict. I mean, funnily enough, on the subject of the limits of US power, there was a really rather remarkable a report in the and I think there was a report in CNN, and there was a report in the Washington Post, or was it the New York Times, that they are indistinguishable in my mind now, but they about how the US has in Trump's renewed strikes on Yemen, they have already spent hundreds of millions of munitions, and then when you add in the enormous operational and personnel costs of deploying aircraft carriers to the Red Sea, countless bombers and fighter jets, and Patriot and air defenses to West Asia, they've already blown $1 billion on this.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
it's like, and then you get into some cost fallacy, because they
Yeah.
believe that, oh well, if only we hit them harder, finally we'll be able to achieve what the Biden administration didn't. Linking things back to what we've been discussing. You mentioned how like Kamala Harris would be doing the same. Like pretty much absolutely the case. Yeah. And people often forget that, Biden was taking an extremely hawkish line on China, and was trying to line up the US and Europe to quote unquote decouple from China entirely, only to be told you literally can't do this. It's impossible.
Mm.
But
Yeah.
that, I mean, that's already been forgotten.
Yeah.
Or if it hasn't been forgotten, maybe they think, oh, well, this is an alternative way of achieving the same thing.
Yeah.
Just madness, madness.
Which is the definition of madness, of course. One of them is trying the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. This is, of course, the latest manifestation of a much, much bigger crisis, about which you can hear more on the regular Decline and Fall show, which will, of course, be coming up later this week. I think, though, this is a story which will run and run, and so forth. Therefore, we will be coming back to it. So, Kit, I think what we'll do is we'll close out the discussion for today, and this will, of course, be out on Monday, the 7th of April, in the later evening, in Perfidious Albion time. We will return to you later in the week with the regular program. But as we've said, you can expect more specials like this, including JFK assassination special coming right up in your direction, in which we consider all of the various different implications of the document release done by the aforementioned Trump administration, and also what document releases like this are actually made to or designed to achieve. Kit, did you have any final words for the good people out there before we close out for today?
Well, no. I mean, well, again, thanks for joining us. Yeah, like I say, well, sorry, like Alex says, we're going to start doing dedicated specials on top of the regular weekly Decline and Fall episodes. We on top of the JFK special, which will be a barn burner. We're going to be doing a real deep dive on the bombing, the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia. We are in the midst of a number of anniversaries of that horrendous criminal campaign waged in 1999, which marked the birth of the unipolar world, but also I think laid the foundations of its destruction, which we're now living through currently. So yeah, stay tuned. Thanks for supporting us. Give us a like, share, subscribe, tell your friends. And if you're feeling really generous, buy us a coffee or two. God bless you, and
All
thanks for
right.
joining.
Thanks, everybody. We'll be back with you again later in the week.